Good morning, Professor Sue-Ann Ware. Thank you for joining us. I'm delighted for our students within the fourth year UNSW landscape course to have the opportunity to hear you speak. You and I have spoken about one of your projects recently, and I thought it was too interesting for the students not to hear about it. So perhaps I might hand over to you straight away. Just a little bit more for everyone. So, Dr. Ware is Professor of Landscape Architecture and Head of School of Architecture and the Built Environment at the University of Newcastle. She's also the founder of Outfit, which she may not get the chance to talk to us today about, which is an all-female collective design group of practitioners and academics. I thought Sue-Ann may be a very nice follow-up speaker after Caroline Pidcock, and I certainly appreciate getting the strong female voice coming in early in our final graduating studio. Sue-Ann, I'm going to pass over to you. We've had a little bit of a word up about white bays. If you could, I'll leave it to you to share your screen when you need to.
Okay, so I just wanted to start off, thanks Patrick, and thanks for having me. It's nice to talk to landscape students. I don't get to do that often enough at the moment. Even if you don't get a talk back, but feel free to send me an email if you have questions and visit our website, which I'll talk about in a second. I want to start off by talking about Henry Bergson, who is Henri Bergson. I'm not very good at French, but he was a really great philosopher who really was questioning things around time for a good portion of his academic and or research career. And so he talked about time in two ways. And as landscape architects, time is really, if you think about, we have plants, we have humans, we have all sorts of environments that we work in, but time is kind of our fourth ingredient, right? So if plants and human are 1 and 2 and ground is 3, time is 4. Now, there's linear time, and Bergson talks about what he calls objective time. So if you think about your watch, your calendar, the timetables, even like the seasons, and as a landscape architect, that's to your advantage, that kind of objective time. But then he talks about what he calls la durée, which is duration or lived time. And I guess this is the time that he calls of the inner subjective experience. So this is time that is felt, lived, and acted. So it may not be linear. For those of you who've done a little bit of work with Indigenous people, you might have heard of what's called abiding time or abiding events, which again is this idea that there is no past, present, and future. It's all one, and it's one story that keeps getting added to. And so the history of Australia and the history of country, and country as an idea, is not about country of the past or pre-colonial past. It's actually, country is a living, breathing, changing thing. So when you work as a landscape architect in Australia, or indeed where there's an Indigenous population, time is a little bit different than linear time or objective time, as Bergson puts it. Now I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to keep that in the back of your head, because that's something that I'll talk to and refer to back at the end. But essentially, today I'm going to talk to you about 2 projects. Let me get it on full. We're having one of those days today. And really, it all began with goats. And why do I say that? All right, I'm a very serious professor or not. But when I first moved up here from Melbourne, I live in Newcastle, which I'll show you where that is in a second, or after the first project. The first project I'm going to talk about is actually on your project site. So, but what I discovered living in Newcastle, which is very much known as the largest Southern Hemisphere coal port in the world, and actually we ship out the most coal than any other country out of this particular port. So it's not something great during the time of climate change and the Anthropocene, but that's what Newcastle does. So what I learned within the first 2 months of moving here was that 75% of the state's toxic sites were in Newcastle. And actually, this is the aerial that you see is actually within the local business district. Newcastle's a series of villages that are now suburban. And really, within our local business district, we had some of the most highly toxic sites. So someone from the state government asked me, well, if there was one thing you could do as a head of school here, what would you do? And I said, look, I'd deal with these sites. I started by pitching what I thought was pretty soft. I said, look, there are lots of sites that are waiting to be redeveloped. This happens to be in Oregon. They put goats on it because goats are natural lawnmowers, but also goats have things in their stomach that can break down things like pesticides and heavy metals and some petrochemicals, and they don't die. You don't want to eat goat cheese or goat milk, but they don't die from it. Their bodies actually physically metabolize it. So goats are kind of this natural animal that can deal with some scary things in the land and in the soil and plants. But from my perspective, it's also a fact that in New South Wales, over 2,500 feral goats are killed every year. And I thought, well, why not take this thing that's seen as a pest and turn it into a positive? So at that point in time, the heavy rail in Newcastle, which bisected us from our harbour, was decommissioned and was just sitting there going feral. And we had lots of places where whenever they're dredging the river, because they go to get very large coal barges in, they put the spills or the dredge onto sites. So I just had this dream of filling all these sites that are basically full of toxic soil, full of plants and animals that would deal with the toxins. Thinking that, no one would ever say yes to that. And the process by which plants remove toxins from the soil is called phytoremediation. And I will give Patrick this slide set, so if you want to learn more about it, this tells you different types. But I want you to think of phytoremediation like your body. So sometimes if you drink too much or you smoke too much, not that any of you would ever do that, your body has an ability to metabolize that and actually break down the toxic chemicals and sweat it out. Some plants can actually absorb toxic things out of the soil and sweat them out. And actually, they can chemically change, they actually metabolize certain toxins and they can chemically change them so that when they sweat it out, it's not harmful anymore. And that's a particular type of phytoremediation. Other plants, when they absorb toxins out of the soil, they hold those toxins in the root. Some hold them in the flowers or in the fruit. Some hold the toxins in the leaves. And what's interesting about phytoremediation, it gets used sometimes, not very often. It takes a lot more time in terms of objective time. It's sort of a 7 to 10 year period to fix a big site. But if a site's going to sit there without being developed for up to 20 years or up to 10 years, it's actually very cheap, much cheaper than what we generally do in Australia, which involves scraping away the toxic soil or putting a cap on top of it. I love Sydney Park. I think it's one of the best projects in the world, but Sydney Park is a capped place. So yes, there is some phytoremediation happening in the water area, mainly through water sensitive urban design, but a lot of what's happening at Sydney Park, which is a great example of a toxic site turned into landscape, a lot of it's happening underneath a cap, which isn't going to get rid of the problem over time. The toxins will still be there and they'll still leach into the water system. So instead of giving me a site in Newcastle, the state government said, oh yeah, you think you're so great. How about we put you in Whitebird Power Station? Which I was like, all right, I'll go to Sydney. We'll do this project there. And so for those of you, your site, you know it, but we're talking about this edge right here. And look, from the drone shots and the aerial, it's a fairly small site. Sorry, it's about 1,000 square meters. Here's the power station. Here's the Anzac Bridge coming over. Sorry, Anzac Bridge coming over. And this is where Don Fraser used to swim in the warmies. This is the ferry terminal. And the fish markets are just off screen, right? So when you look at it, so one of the things that's interesting, this used to be a coal-fire power station. And so one of the reasons this site is so toxic is when they cooled down the machines after, and the coal was used to power the street cars, so the trams, right? And when Sydney removed all its trams, it didn't need this power station anymore. Serendipitously, now we have a light rail in Sydney, but clearly we don't need it to be powered by coal. But when they were washing down the machines, basically hundreds of different agents, soaping agents, chemical agents, reagents. The coal itself basically ended up on this site where we were. This is a typical consultant report looking at, and what the little dots, the kind of yellow and green dots are, they tell you where they took a soil sample, and then there's a series of things that are really, really toxic on site. So heavy metals, zinc, lead, benzene, you name it, everything, asbestos, everything except for radioactive things were on this site. So it's a pretty scary place. So we decided really we were going to do something quick and cheap, partially because we wanted to see how quick we could get results and what we could pick out quickly. And we did a series of gardens. So what you see in these circles, these are single cultures, so a single type of plant. So like that number 1 is vetiver, or vetiver grass. And then number 2 is corn, and so on and so on. So these are monocultures. And then in between the monocultures, and we planted 5 different plots of the exact same stuff. We're testing different soils in different parts of the site. And then between them, we had meadows. So we had a big mix. And so what we're trying to do here is make a design gesture, but also think about whether broadacre meadow approaches are the best way to get toxins up in a year. Now, this is only an annual, this project in particular was only for a year, so it was really only an annual test. This is, for those of you who've gone to site, this is that Prestige car park. So there was a really simple planting logic. So if the power station is here and there happens to be a giant concrete drainage channel here, which was no longer in use, we basically graduated the planting up so that things would be higher in the back and lower in the front. We did a lot of documentation, and there's a terrific film on the website, just Power Plants Phytoremediation Garden. That's the website address. By Dr. Ainsley Murray, who works at UNSW in Cuba. And they did a fantastic film of us and this particular process. But essentially what I'm showing you today is showing you how the species, we planted them, and then how they started to grow and go a bit feral. And obviously the circles here are monocultures, and certain plants grew better, certain plants never took off, some took off later, some took off sooner. And that's partially to do with growth conditions and irrigation, which we did have to irrigate this particular garden in the beginning, and we stopped irrigating in the end. But some of them have to do with the toxins. So some things did better. Now, these are trials that generally happen in a laboratory. So some of the plants we were using, particularly the Australian plants, were the first time they were tested in the world. So you can see these are sort of the sunflower plots. In the end, the sunflowers go crazy. We planted things like lucerne because it puts nitrogen back in the soil, but also it takes some pretty nasty things like asbestos out. And over time, you start to see we transformed this kind of bare site that had lots of problems. And we let the weeds come through, because also weeds, even though Australia doesn't necessarily like weeds, weeds are really good at phytoremediation as well, particularly rush grasses and pampas grass and all the things that councils don't let you plant. Typical, right? Weeds are good at lots of things, just like immigrants. So we also tracked what grew better. Did the monocultures, the single species plot, grow higher and better than the meadows, which were companion species? And to be honest with you, the meadows in the end were the better growers. That's because they carpeted the landscape. We took we worked with a scientist from UTS, Megan Murray, and the Phyto Lab, and we looked at what plants took out what toxins. So for instance, and again, this is all detailed on the website, but for instance, that red column is lead, and so plant number 22, which I think is sunflowers, took out a lot of lead. And plant number 4, which was carrots, took out a lot of lead. So what that tells you is that if you happen to live in a residential area, so this is a site before we got a hold of it, pretty feral, lots of goss, lots of my favorite lantana. And then this is how we left the site. And it's still got a fair bit of blooming. So some of the things we were testing there was things like vegetables. So if you happen to live on a toxic site, if you know that carrots take up lead and you have lead problems, you wouldn't eat those carrots. But if you find out that carrots don't take up lead and you have lead problems, then it's safe to eat them. So we're testing a few things like that, but that comes in bigger and bolder in the second project. Second project's really in Newcastle. Those of you who've never visited us, we're 3 hours north of Sydney. We're a bit different to you. We're a small town in a way, about 300,000 people. And as you can see, we're sort of on the water here. This river basically delivers, this is the Hunter River, goes up the Hunter Valley, and this river delivers all the coal out to all sorts of places in the world. The site that we're talking about here is about 6 kilometers from downtown Newcastle. And it's the former steel factory. So in 1993, the steelworks left Newcastle, leaving a very giant vacant land site. Some of that's been repurposed for coal infrastructure, but we're anticipating now with coal slowly dying that we're going to have a whole bunch of vacant post-industrial contaminated land. So there's a little bit of history. I won't go into too deep, but essentially it was a really heavy, dirty site and has lots and lots of BHP, left a lot of things in the ground. What it was supposed to be when Newcastle was first colonized, it was a prison colony, but what it was supposed to be was a botanic gardens, and it was never really realized, right? So this is the river, it was a lowland, it was a very important site for Awabakal and Woromai people. It was a meeting ground, and then of course it became this factory. But what happened is the first CEO of the factory, Delprat, decided that he wanted to overlook his workers every day because he was so proud of what they were doing. So he built his house on this hill. The soil here is the same as the soil here, which is now all suburbia. So we've been given this site to start with, which is the cottage, its immediate surrounds, and a bit of a bigger bit. And what we decided to do this was really looking at more residential applications. So if the first one was about what developers could do on a brownfield site, that they could get in quick and easy and try to get as much toxins out in a year or two, the second one is really about just across this kind of big road is suburbia. So we were trying to think about all the toxins across all of Newcastle. What can we plant here that people would normally have in their gardens, both native and non-native? What can we plant here that shows people the kinds of things that are safe to eat, the kinds of things that aren't safe to eat, the kinds of things that pollinators like bees and birds, if they're on a toxic site, will take toxins with them, the kinds of things they won't take with them, the natives, the non-natives. And the garden's really 4 different types of gardens. So the first is a veggie patch and a flower garden. And again, typical suburbia in Australia, it's very much about growing flowers and food. And unfortunately, because our land is so toxic across Newcastle, not just this site, that can be quite dangerous for human health. So these are some of them in process, and you can see I'm a very messy gardener. My dog tends to feature in a couple of these slides. Sorry, she just likes to be on film. But we're really testing some important edibles and some important floral things. So for instance, sunflowers and lead, we had still have a high concentration of lead. Now this particular trial is a multi-year trial. So this is a 10 to 20-year trial. So while we'll trial different vegetables and flowers in an annual basis, and this is what you're seeing in this image is an annual, you'll see the onions and the garlic and in this case basil, we are testing things that local Novocastrians are going to plant and eat. So we're trying to show them what's safe. In the foreground are things like sweet potato. So roots, often things that grow underground like carrots, beets, sweet potatoes, etc., tend to absorb the toxins in their fruit, which again, you don't want to eat a sweet potato off this particular site. It gets a bit feral, like I said, I'm not the best gardener, but you can see that, you know, it is a proper working vegetable garden, and we test fruit, we test the leaves, we test the soils. And again, you know, it looks like any other vegetable garden you've ever seen, but it's really important to know whether or not the fruit, the leaves, in the case of beetroot and lettuce, absorb certain toxins. What we found, and this is Megan Murray from UTS doing her scientific evaluation of in this case capsicums. It's what we found to date. We've published on the website. It's all open access because we want everyone to know the kinds of things that you should or should not plant. And we've got a lot of resources on the website for people to get their soils tested in the first place. It may just mean that you make your garden in an elevated bed. So on the other side of the house, we decided to do your kind of typical Edna Walling bush garden. We wanted to make it kind of cottage garden, kind of a little bit of English with a few native species. These are kangaroo paws and a fair bit of weeds. You can tell I'm not the best weeder. And why that was important is that these plants are going to be in place a lot longer, right? So they're not an annual crop. They're perennials, and they're things that people plant typically next to their house. They bloom, they might have exciting foliage. We're interested in them in lots of different ways, partially for pollinators, like I said, bees and birds, and whether or not the toxins go into the flowers. But we're also interested in them because a number of them are native species, and trying to work out if native species can take out some of the scary toxins. Now, there's a lot of knowledge of North American plants and even Chinese plants, but there's not a lot of knowledge on native Australian plants. We had some really interesting results with these. You can see that they bloom like normal plants, but the ones in the middle are particularly interesting. Now, these plants are supposed to be white, and they've come out pink. What we found out after we sampled them and worked out what was going on is that they were absorbing so much iron in the soil that actually changed the color of the flower. So sometimes plants, again, if they're digesting or they're absorbing toxins, turn funny colors, like litmus paper in chemistry class. These are litmus plants, and so their flowers turn the color. In this case, they're tinted by iron, and so they've turned this funky color, which they were supposed to be white. I promise they weren't red. Oh, I'm stuck. Whoops, I missed the meadow. So the other thing that we did is we planted a series, because we have this site a bit longer, we planted a series of trees and grasses. And this is to see, again, are there longer term species such as an orchard, A, fruits, vegetables, and flowers, but also B, are there longer term species when we're doing things like carbon crediting, or we're doing things to do with carbon sequestration, which we all know that gums, blue gums, are really good at carbon sequestration. So can we mix phytoremediation and carbon sequestration? What happens? And so we planted a series of orchards which are with a range. Again, sorry about Juno, she just loves having her picture taken. And we're obviously testing existing plants and existing trees on site, but this is a much longer term planting regime. The grasses have gone bazoolas, and so grasses, like anything else with very fibrous roots or rhizomatic roots, are really good at phytoremediation, and you often see them in water-sensitive urban design because of that. Again, things like crepe metals, so typical things you see in people's backyards or on streetscapes, again, where heavy metals are very, very dangerous. So do crepe metals absorb heavy metals and benzene, or things like gum trees. The last bit is much more of a broadacre approach, similar to what we did at White Bay, because just across the fence are acres and acres of empty land. And we thought, well, let's try a different kind of meadow, and let's see what we can get out of a broadacre treatment, something that will self-seed. So it actually went bazoolas last year. There's a little mulberry tree in the middle of it, but you can see what's next door, all sorts of colonizers. And really, the cornflower, I mean, you can see the heavy industry in the distance there, but the cornflowers and various sunflowers, and in some cases poppies, went bazoolas. So we had this incredible floral meadow, which was quite beautiful, but at the same time, we knew that these cornflowers in particular were taking out a very specific toxin, copper. So, and then we let the whole thing go feral, we've mowed it, and it'll come back up this year. This project is much more, White Bays was really about Landcom and urban growth, and really they want to develop that site. What can we do quick and easy and get out? This one's a much longer term project. It's got like I said, a 10-year lease on it. And so what they've asked us to do is do lots of education and outreach to communities. So we have open days, we have garden tours, we have all sorts of things like do-it-yourself advice, we have exhibitions, we do films. So this is much more an outreach project, and it's much more about educating the public about toxics and soils, and it's much more about understanding what you can do bottom up, right? We've put together a series of botanic drawings and cards that you can see what they take out, what some of the ethnobotanic or the kind of cultural history of the plants are. And of course, with the Australian natives, we might know the cultural histories, but we don't necessarily know whether or not they take out toxins as of yet. This is just some samples of the do-it-yourself guide to a phytoremediation garden. We tell you how to take samples, we tell you who to send them to. And so I think I'll end it there because I know Patrick's got some questions. But I guess what I would say with this particular project, there is, of course, that objective time. So how plants help heal the soil over time and through a natural, non-synthetic way. But of course, we have to then dispose of all the plants through proper composting. We can't take them off site. And yes, of course, we can't change the ecologies. We've just found out that after our first successful year that yes, we will indeed be jumping the fence. So that big field that you see in front of us, eventually we'll get our hands on. And the scary big boat that you see on the right-hand background of the screen, that's a coal boat. And it's probably about 3/4 full. And that's about 100 of those leave Newcastle every week. That's how many tons of coal we export. So hopefully in the not too distant future, none of these will be there, and I'll be talking to you about remediating former coal loader sites. That's the dream. You got to have a dream.
Have the dream.
But I guess, yeah, so I was thinking about your site over the weekend and thinking about what I would do if it was my major project. And I guess one, landscape architects have got to stop thinking about instant wins. We've got to stop thinking about even within our lifetime. You know, I'm sort of an age now that I've educated enough people that are now in ALA and doing super work and practice that I think, well, at least something will become of someone I educated, including Patrick. But for me, it's like, no, actually, I've got to think 100 years after I'm long gone, right? I've got to think of what the land can do, what the culture can do, how humans and natural ecosystems engage together, how we can learn from each other. And I think the other thing that's kind of dawned on me with this one is that this is so specific to site because the toxins are so specific to the industries that happen there, but also, you know, the site was something before it was White Bay Power Station, before it was BHP Steelworks. And now that we're working a lot with Indigenous people and working on country, how do you use sort of the respect and the land management regimes of working on country in a contemporary, and in this case, post-industrial or urban sense? And so we're doing a lot now with some Awabakal ranges on this next site where they're saying, well, here's what we typically would have done before this site became polluted with BHP. Could we do it again? Which is a really interesting kind of combination of what I would call a cultural knowledge of a site that predates colonization and what that might do in terms of phytoremediation with science. All right.
Sue-Ann, I know you've got to go in about 8 minutes. Brilliant lecture. Thank you. It's wonderful to see your usual rigor and so many ways of thinking, and you're expressing a lot of things that I was intending to bring up and also to ask you questions. So my question list has got shorter, but I still have a couple. You've implied into it, and I think it's important graduating out of fourth year to have a level of currency with what's happening in the industry, and I will talk about it more with all the students. We haven't spoken about it yet, but the ALA conference coming up, I think, in the only city that it could, in Perth, I think its theme is spectacle versus collapse. But I think within those two words are some issues that you're already talking about, but could you talk a little bit more about the shift perhaps for landscape architects to move from almost an aesthetic and the spectacle to doing what you're doing and thinking of plants as almost a piece of scientific alchemy, a partner within a sort of piece of the machine?
Yeah, it's kind of. I remember thinking like in the late 90s about, landscape urbanism, the death of form, right? And composition was going to go out the window and we were all going to be about processes, which of course phytoremediation is a process. But I think humans still, and there's lots of psychological and neurological tests to prove that there's an aesthetic preference for something, whether it's order. So we're not talking about Versailles, right? We're not doing a totally geometric landscape here.
I don't mind a bit of Versailles.
But it's also understanding that landscapes work really hard and landscapes are processes themselves. And so what's great about that is when you combine both the aesthetic proposition of a landscape plus the fact that it will work as infrastructure, green, blue, in this case, phytoremediation. And you think about, in this case, an orchard is a cultural garden, right? A cottage garden, Edna Walling is a certain aesthetic. A veggie garden is another kind of aesthetic and or, human necessity. And obviously a meadow is a kind of a romantic English. If you called it a heath, then you'd be closer to maybe what an Australian version of a wildflower, being from Western Australia. We're not even a patch on that. But I look at that and saying, okay, we have all this ecological knowledge. Now, I can't create nature on these sites. Like, it's just not going to happen. And it actually doesn't work within the cultural landscapes. But I can look at natural processes and I can look at processes that plants do to try to take this landscape back to what it could be. And take this landscape, it's never going to be back to pre-colonization. That's not the whole point. It's actually about understanding that we've done this to the planet. Now let's own it. And let's own it well beyond our lifetimes. But let's not just keep it to ourselves and be great academics and get papers in Nature, because that's what academics do these days. Because I know lots of you read Nature, not. It's actually about sharing that with the public and doing very low-tech, very accessible materials that other people can do this and take it much further than I ever will, but also so that people that live here feel they have agency in their own landscape, feel that they can actually do something about living on toxic land, which we do in Newcastle and in Sydney. And I venture to say that most of Australia lives on toxic land. And so I guess the way I look at that is that maybe we started off as a profession that was more compositional or more, and beautiful compositions. I don't have a problem with that. And, if I could be a modernist, I would, but I just don't have that aesthetic. I'm much more messy, as you can see. But I think it's understanding, I'm from America, so Frederick Law Olmsted was all about landscape infrastructure. He just didn't call it that. I mean, the largest tip site in America, which happened to be Central Park, right? So he used landscape. It's still a cultured landscape. It doesn't try to return it to nature. It still looks designed, but it's doing all this work in dealing with what's, in that case, under the ground, which was a tip. And so for me, it's that we've forgotten that kind of double purposing of landscape and its processes and humans and their processes. I think we're going back to that, and I think we're going back to understanding that this thing's going to far outlast us. We're not as lucky as architects who tend to get, a building and then 100 years later they might still have that building. Landscapes tend to get eaten up because they think it's empty and then it gets redeveloped into something else. We're much more temporal than that. But if you can show them the value of that, both environmentally and in this case economically, that there is a chance for people to go, actually, maybe we need to do this everywhere.
What an exciting concept. You've already talked about this long term, but certainly I want to have discussions with the class about 200, 300, 400, 500 years. These projects are leading into that, and your languaging and your discussion is very much on tone about that. You mentioned when we had a quick conversation before this, the Biennale and a project in Girona. Perhaps you'd like to just give that a couple of minutes.
So there's two projects I think that are like much better than I'll ever be. They had bigger budgets. No, the one in Franklyn didn't have a bigger budget. So in a couple of weeks' time, the Landscape Biennale, which Patrick now has the link, which you can all register for free, has what's called the Rosa Barber Prize. So the 11 finalists, they all present for the biggest prize in Europe, but I would say in the world. And it's a very, I've been on the jury, it's a fantastic thing. One of the projects in there by EMF Studios or Marty Branch is called Girona Shores, and it's a combination of bottom up. So he started it with his office and brought them out in the field. He's a landscape architect. They did some maintenance regimes and regimes of care, and they showed the city and then created manuals to rewild essentially this ring around Girona, which is a city in northern Spain. And then that grew to being about reserves and replanting. And it's become this massive green, not just wedge, green ring around the city of Girona, but that started with Marty and his very small, very tactical, very almost, he calls it confetti. You know, he sort of does something here and then lets it happen, and everything from mowing regimes to pruning regimes to let's plant something here but not here. You know, and it's an incredible project to see evolve. And if you watch him present it, he's a very exuberant presenter. The other project I was thinking about, which is closer to home, is in Canberra, and it's really close to me and my home because my partner worked on it for 13 years. It's the National Arboretum. He was with Taylor Colletti Laughlin at the time. His name's Chris Johnstone. He essentially for 13 years worked with, in the beginning, John Stanhope, who was the chief minister, to basically do 100 different forests of 100 endangered, rare, various ethnobotanically relevant trees. Now, this is the largest carbon sequestration project in the Southern Hemisphere. So imagine each 100 trees is on 250 hectares. I mean, it is a huge series of forests, and sort of, oh, well, that'd be a good 15, 20 years ago. So if you go there, you get to experience forests in various stages of growth and various kinds of single species forests, but then you walk through 100 different forests. Now imagine being a minister, so think government, who you can get unelected basically every 3 years, and saying, look, this is going to outlast my tenure for sure, but I'm going to invest in this. I'm going to put, in this case, 65 million. And yes, there's a visitor center that probably took most of the money by TZG. It's a lovely visitor center. But I'm going to invest in this, and I'm going to invest in it in a place that's prone to fire. And I'm going to think about how to rethink this landscape to be something that's going to long outlive me. And then Chris, as the landscape architect working on this, had to say, okay, so Chris is a very good plants person. He's incredibly good at this, but he had to say, look, I'm only going to be in charge of this project for a certain number of years. And the budget kept shrinking and swelling. One day it'd be 2 million, next day it would be 50. It was one of those very political footballs. But to actually get this built and to see it change over time and see it as this major investment, that's just someone, and in this case, I will give Stanhope his due. He just said, look, we're going to do this because I know that my children's children are going to need this. Now, that's the political time cycle. So one of the things you guys are dealing with, you've got a state government, you've got a fantastic mayor, Clover Moore, can't say anything better than her. I've got to say your deputy Lord Mayor, she's awesome as well. If you can get Jess on, She's got she's written a book about utopia. She finds examples of people who had big ideas of cities all over the world, like one that said, we're going to end homelessness. Here's how we do it. She's great at that. So you've got to have leaders and politicians that have this visions that will say, look, well beyond the time when I get ousted, this will be big. So those are the two projects I think are great. But I venture to say that Clover's in a fair few too.
Interesting.
Very often.
Good wrap on Clover. Dr. Sue-Ann Ware, thank you so much. As well as a rock star, you're just a clever cookie, and it's terrific to have you on our screens and in our studio. I'll let you go, and we will continue many of these as streams of conversations in coming weeks.
Hopefully you invite me back to final reviews.
Yes, we'd love to.
All right.
I'm already thinking, can we get you, Clover Moore? Who can we get in the room?
That's it. See you later.
Hey, thanks so much.
Have a
Bye.
good day.